Evelyn Carter stood on the front porch of Birchwood Lane, with 2 worn suitcases at her feet, while strangers measured her living room through the open front door. Her late husband's relatives had taken the house she had spent 30 years restoring, and the court had called it legal. 4 days later, deep inside the Blue Ridge Mountains, she unlocked a forgotten cabin her grandmother had hidden from everyone. Beneath one loose floorboard waited something her family had never imagined still existed. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. To understand why that forgotten cabin mattered more than the house she had lost, everything had to begin nearly 3 decades earlier. The first time Evelyn Carter saw Birchwood Lane, rain had washed the narrow street into shades of silver. The old farmhouse leaned slightly toward the road as though years of neglect had made it tired. Paint peeled from the porch rails. The flower beds were buried beneath weeds. Several windows looked cloudy enough to hide the light inside. Her husband, Richard Hart, never bothered to leave the truck. "This place is falling apart," he muttered, studying the roof through the windshield. "It'll cost a fortune before anyone could live here." Evelyn barely heard him. She was looking at the wraparound porch, the maple tree standing proudly beside it, and the kitchen windows facing the backyard. She imagined morning coffee where sunlight poured across worn wooden floors. She imagined shelves lined with handmade pottery, fresh herbs growing beneath the windows, and guests gathering around a long table filled with laughter instead of silence. The realtor hurried across the porch, shielding paperwork beneath her jacket. "It needs a lot of work," she warned with an apologetic smile. Evelyn rested her hand against the old brass doorknob. "Sometimes," she answered softly, "that's exactly why it's worth saving." Inside, Richard noticed cracked plaster. Evelyn noticed solid beams. Richard pointed toward outdated cabinets. Evelyn pictured them painted warm white beneath soft lighting. Richard calculated expenses. Evelyn imagined a home. That difference would shape the next 30 years of their marriage. Later that evening, they sat inside the tiny rental duplex they had called home for nearly 6 years. Inspection reports covered the kitchen table beside unpaid bills and mortgage estimates. The numbers refused to cooperate. Their savings were not enough. Richard rubbed his forehead and finally pushed the paperwork aside. "We should walk away." Evelyn stared at the photographs of Birchwood Lane. "I can't," he sighed. "Then I don't know what you expect." After Richard went to bed, Evelyn picked up the phone. She called the one person who had always known the difference between wanting something and belonging somewhere. Grandma Mabel answered after the second ring. She listened quietly while Evelyn explained everything. The inspection report, the missing down payment, the repairs, the risks. When Evelyn finally stopped talking, silence lingered for several seconds. Then Mabel asked only one question. "When you walked inside, did it feel like home?" Evelyn closed her eyes. She could almost smell the old pine floors again. "Yes, come see me tomorrow." The following afternoon, Grandma Mabel placed a sealed envelope on her dining table. Inside rested a cashier's check large enough to close the gap between hope and reality. Evelyn immediately shook her head. "I can't accept this. You can. I'll spend years paying you back." Her grandmother smiled gently. "I never asked for repayment." Evelyn looked up. "What do you mean?" "This isn't for your marriage." The older woman's voice remained calm, but something behind her eyes felt unusually serious. "It belongs to you." Evelyn laughed softly. "Richard and I share everything." Grandma Mabel did not laugh with her. Instead, she reached into a drawer and removed a small folded note written in careful blue ink. She handed it across the table. "Keep records of everything you contribute." Evelyn frowned. "Why?" "Because love remembers differently than paperwork." The sentence sounded strange, almost unnecessary. Richard had never given Evelyn a reason to doubt him. He praised her ideas, he admired her creativity. He often introduced her as the reason every room they entered somehow felt welcoming. There was no reason to imagine that one day those same hands would build a house the legal record Deb would barely remember. Grandma Mabel stood and walked toward the front window. Without turning around, she spoke again. "If life ever asks you to choose between trusting memory and keeping proof," she paused. "Keep the proof." Evelyn slipped the folded note inside her purse. convinced her grandmother was simply being overly cautious. She had no idea that years later, one missing piece of paper would become the difference between losing everything and finding the only truth her family could never steal. Richard loved telling people that success came from discipline. He repeated it at business dinners, charity auctions, and networking breakfasts. He believed the right words, spoken often enough, eventually became truth. People admired his confidence. Clients trusted his polished smile. Friends called him dependable. Evelyn watched something different. She watched how every compliment slowly drifted toward him, even when it had begun somewhere else. It happened so gradually that she almost missed it. After they moved into Birchwood Lane, every evening belonged to repairs. Richard handled financing and contractors. Evelyn handled nearly everything else. She stripped wallpaper until her fingertips blistered. She sanded hardwood floors room by room. She searched estate sales outside Asheville for antique fixtures that fit the character of the old farmhouse. She studied paint samples under changing light before choosing colors that made each room feel warm instead of expensive. When neighbors stopped by, they noticed immediately. "This place feels alive," one woman said during an autumn gathering. Richard smiled before Evelyn could answer. "We've worked hard on it," the word landed softly. Evelyn smiled anyway. At the time, it felt harmless. Months later, Richard invited 2 real estate investors for dinner. By then, the kitchen had become the heart of the house. White cabinets reflected the afternoon sun. Handmade shelves displayed pottery collected from local craftsmen. Fresh rosemary grew beside the back window. One investor paused before sitting down. "This kitchen sells a feeling," he said. "Who designed it?" Richard poured another glass of wine. "I've always believed buyers respond to warmth." Evelyn looked up. Her hands were still damp from arranging flowers she had cut only an hour earlier. Richard never looked at her. The conversation moved on. Nobody realized someone had quietly disappeared from it. That evening, Evelyn stood alone washing dishes while Richard carried coffee into the living room for his guests. She stared at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. For the first time, she asked herself a question she immediately tried to ignore. Why hadn't he mentioned her name? The answer seemed too small to matter, so she let it go. Richard's business expanded quickly during the following years. His specialty became restoring historic homes before listing them for wealthy buyers moving into western North Carolina. Clients praised his eye for detail. The truth lived inside Evelyn's notebooks. She created design boards. She selected finishes. She rewrote listing descriptions until empty houses sounded like homes waiting for families. Richard reviewed them, changed a few words, and signed his name beneath every proposal. One afternoon, he placed a printed brochure onto the kitchen table. Across the front appeared a new slogan: "Creative Property Restoration by Richard Hart." Evelyn traced the letters with one finger. Every photograph inside showed rooms she had planned. Every color belonged to choices she had made. Not once did her name appear. Richard walked in carrying groceries. "What do you think?" She forced herself to smile. "It looks professional." He kissed her forehead. "I knew you'd understand." That sentence lingered long after he left the room. Not because he thanked her, because he never had. Grandma Mabel noticed before Evelyn did. She visited one Saturday carrying homemade blackberry preserves. Richard was away meeting clients, leaving the dining table buried beneath flooring samples, invoices, photographs, and handwritten notes. Mabel stood quietly beside the table. She picked up one folder, then another. Finally, she looked at Evelyn. "Whose business is this?" "Richard's." "And whose handwriting is all over these pages?" Evelyn hesitated. "Mine." Grandma nodded slowly. "Does anyone else know that?" Evelyn laughed, trying to dismiss the question. "It doesn't matter. It matters if people begin believing someone else's story." The older woman reached into her handbag. Instead of preserves or recipes, she placed an old iron key onto the table. Blue thread had been tied carefully through its handle. Evelyn frowned. "What's this, my cabin? You still own that place?" "I do. I thought nobody used it anymore." "They don't." Grandma slid the key toward her. "Now you will." Evelyn looked confused. "I don't understand." Mabel leaned back in her chair. "A woman should always have one place in this world where nobody else decides whether she belongs." The words unsettled Evelyn. Richard had never raised a hand against her. He paid bills on time. He opened doors. He remembered anniversaries. From the outside, their marriage looked almost perfect. So why did her grandmother sound afraid? That question followed Evelyn for weeks. Then came the paperwork. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Rain tapped gently against the windows while Evelyn prepared dinner. Richard entered carrying a slim leather folder. "We should refinance," he said casually. Interest rates finally dropped. Evelyn wiped flour from her hands. "I'll read everything after dinner, you can if you want." He smiled, but my attorney already reviewed it. He spread several documents across the kitchen table. Most looked routine: loan adjustments, insurance updates, property restructuring. Richard pointed exactly where each signature belonged. She signed once, then again, then paused. One paragraph mentioned ownership structure. "What does this change?" Richard barely glanced down. "Nothing important. It says title, standard lender language." She looked at the paragraph again. The legal wording felt unfamiliar. Complicated. Grandma Mabel's voice drifted back into her memory. "Love remembers differently than paperwork. Keep records." For several seconds, Evelyn simply stared at the page. Richard sighed, not loudly, not impatiently, just enough. The sound carried disappointment instead of anger, as though asking questions had become an inconvenience. Evelyn hated disappointing people, especially him. She picked up the pen again. Her signature settled neatly beneath every line. Richard collected the papers almost before the ink had dried. "You saved us a lot of trouble," he said. After dinner, he carried the folder upstairs into his home office. He locked the door behind him. That had never happened before. Evelyn noticed. She almost followed him. Instead, she remained alone in the kitchen. The house suddenly felt different, not colder, just less certain. The next morning, she opened the second drawer beside the stove to put away Grandma Mabel's folded note. She touched the blue ink for a long moment before placing it back, exactly where it had always been. Then she whispered something she could not explain. "I hope you're wrong." 3 months later, Grandma Mabel called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded weaker than Evelyn had ever heard it. "Come see me," she said, "and bring the cabin key." Evelyn drove to Burnsville the following morning with the iron key resting inside her purse. The winding mountain roads felt quieter than usual, and every mile gave Grandma Mabel's words more weight. "Bring the cabin key." There had been urgency in her voice. Not fear exactly, something steadier, the urgency of someone who knew time was running short. Grandma's small farmhouse stood at the end of a gravel lane surrounded by old oak trees. The porch swing moved gently in the mountain breeze, though nobody sat in it. Evelyn parked beside the garden and noticed weeds growing where vegetables had once flourished. That alone unsettled her. Mabel never let weeds stay long. Inside, the familiar scent of peppermint tea and cedar still filled the house, but the rooms felt smaller than Evelyn remembered. Her grandmother sat beside the living room window wrapped in a quilt despite the warm afternoon. She smiled when Evelyn entered, but the smile carried exhaustion. "You came." "Of course I did." Evelyn bent to hug her gently. She could feel how much weight Mabel had lost. For a few minutes they spoke about ordinary things. Richard's growing business, the changing leaves. A neighbor who had finally sold an old dairy farm. The conversation drifted naturally, almost peacefully. Then Mabel looked toward Evelyn's purse. "Did you bring it?" Evelyn quietly removed the old iron key. Her grandmother nodded once. "Good. You've worried me ever since your phone call. I know. What is this really about?" Mabel remained silent long enough that the ticking clock on the mantel became almost distracting. Finally, she asked, "Has Richard brought you more papers lately?" Evelyn blinked. "How did you know?" "Answer me. Some refinancing documents, insurance updates, business paperwork, and you signed them?" Evelyn hesitated. "Yes." Mabel closed her eyes, not dramatically, simply with the sadness of someone watching a storm arrive exactly when expected. "I hoped I was wrong." Evelyn moved closer. "Grandma, what aren't you telling me?" Instead of answering, Mabel slowly reached toward a small cedar box beside her chair. Inside were old receipts bundled with ribbon, canceled checks, faded photographs, and neatly labeled envelopes. She searched carefully until finding one tied with blue string. "This stays sealed," placed it into Evelyn's hands. "No matter what happens, don't open it now." Evelyn frowned. "Then when?" "When your memory is no longer enough." The words made little sense. "My memory of what?" "Of your own life." Evelyn laughed nervously. "I'm not losing my memory, no." Mabel looked directly into her eyes. I'm talking about something much more dangerous. The room fell quiet again. Outside, wind stirred dry leaves across the porch. When enough people repeat the same story, Mabel continued, even honest people begin doubting what they know. Evelyn stared at the envelope. What story? That the house belonged to someone else. She looked up immediately. Birchwood Lane belongs to Richard and me. It belongs to both of you because you built it together, exactly. Mabel shook her head. No, the answer surprised Evelyn. No, you built far more than Richard ever admitted. Evelyn smiled faintly. We're married. Marriage should never erase the person standing beside you. For the first time, irritation crept into Evelyn's voice. You've never trusted Richard. I've never trusted paperwork handled by only one person. The distinction mattered. Evelyn could hear it. Still, she defended him. He provides for us. So do you. He earns the income. And who created the homes that earned his reputation? Evelyn opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The silence answered before words could. Mabel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. This isn't about whether Richard loves you. It isn't, no. It's about what happens if love stops protecting you. Those words lingered long after neither woman spoke. Late that afternoon, Mabel insisted on walking outside despite Evelyn's concern. They moved slowly through the backyard until reaching an old stone path leading toward a weathered tool shed. Behind it stood an aging pickup truck. Mabel rested one hand against its side. Years ago, she said quietly, I made copies. Copies of what? Everything that mattered. Evelyn looked confused. The cashier's check, the closing documents, the bank receipts. I kept records because I wanted proof that my gift belonged to you. Evelyn's heartbeat slowed. Why would anyone question that? Because paper disappears. The sentence landed harder than expected. Mabel looked toward the distant mountains. People lose receipts. Files get replaced, memories fade. But copies, she gently touched the iron key. Copies survive. Evelyn suddenly remembered the folded note still hidden in the kitchen drawer back at Birchwood Lane. Keep records. She had thought it unnecessary. Now she wasn't so certain. As evening approached, she helped Grandma back inside. Near the front door, Mabel stopped walking. There is something else. Evelyn waited. The cabin. What about it? There is one loose floorboard. She spoke slowly, making certain every word settled. Under the kitchen table, Evelyn frowned. I've never even been inside. You will be. What's under the floor? Mabel smiled sadly. If I tell you now, she paused. You'll never understand why I hid it. Evelyn wanted to ask again. Instead, she nodded. The older woman leaned forward and kissed her forehead. When life finally forces you to choose between accepting someone else's version of you, her fingers gently closed around Evelyn's hand. Go to the cabin. 2 months later, Grandma Mabel passed away peacefully. The funeral filled the small mountain church with neighbors, old friends, and quiet stories of kindness stretching back decades. Richard stood beside Evelyn through every handshake and every condolence. He looked supportive, attentive, even loving. On the drive home, he reached across the console and squeezed her hand. I'm glad you still have me. Evelyn smiled through her grief. So am I. She believed every word. That night, she placed the sealed blue envelope into an old cedar chest in the bedroom closet, exactly as Grandma had instructed. She never opened it. Years passed. The envelope remained untouched. The cabin key stayed hidden, and somewhere inside Richard's locked office, another folder quietly grew thicker with documents Evelyn had never been allowed to read. She did not know it yet. But one signature after another was slowly rewriting the ownership of everything she believed they had built together. Years passed so quietly that Evelyn almost believed Grandma Mabel's warnings belonged to another lifetime. Birchwood Lane flourished. The hydrangeas she planted along the front walk returned every spring. The porch she rebuilt by hand became the place where neighbors lingered over iced tea. Richard's business grew from a small local agency into one of the best-known historic property firms in western North Carolina. People praised his vision. Evelyn stopped correcting them. She became the invisible engine behind every success. She selected finishes before dawn, answered late-night emails from contractors, and spent weekends staging homes for open houses while Richard met clients wearing pressed suits and polished shoes. By evening, he returned with signed contracts and stories about another satisfied buyer. He always thanked her in private. He almost never acknowledged her in public. The pattern became so familiar that Evelyn no longer recognized it as loss. Then Richard's younger sister, Denise Hart, began appearing more often. She called herself helpful. She organized family paperwork. She offered to sort insurance files. She volunteered to simplify Richard's expanding business records. She smiled easily, brought homemade pies, and always spoke as if she were doing everyone a favor. Evelyn wanted to like her. Most days she did. Still, Denise had a habit that quietly unsettled her. Whenever she visited, she wandered through the house alone. She opened filing cabinets while looking for stamps. She searched kitchen drawers while asking for tea bags. She lingered near Richard's office longer than seemed necessary. When Evelyn mentioned it once, Richard laughed. "She's just curious." "About our paperwork?" "About everything." The answer sounded harmless. Even so, Evelyn started noticing small things. A utility receipt she remembered placing on the dining table disappeared. A folder containing paint invoices showed up in Richard's office instead of the kitchen. The folded blue note from Grandma Mabel remained untouched in the second drawer beside the stove, but twice Evelyn found the drawer slightly open after Denise visited. She began closing it more carefully. One October afternoon, Richard came home carrying another thick envelope. "This one's routine," he said. He loosened his tie while dropping the papers onto the kitchen island. "Our accountant recommended cleaning up a few ownership issues before tax season." Evelyn looked at the stack. "There seem to be a lot of ownership issues lately." Richard smiled without looking up. "That's what happens when businesses grow." She poured coffee into 2 mugs before sitting across from him. "I'd like my own attorney to review these." Richard finally met her eyes. For just a second, surprise crossed his face. Then came the familiar smile. "Of course." He slid the documents toward her. "Take all the time you need." Instead of relief, she felt something stranger. Why had he agreed so quickly? That evening, after Richard left for a dinner meeting with investors, Evelyn spread every page across the dining table. Most of the language was dense. She understood enough to realize several forms connected Richard's personal assets with newer business entities. One paragraph mentioned Birchwood Lane as collateral supporting expanded commercial credit. She frowned. The house? She remembered discussing a business loan years earlier, but Richard had assured her their home would remain protected. She picked up her reading glasses and looked again. The legal wording remained difficult. Her phone rang. It was Denise. "I heard Richard asked you to look over the paperwork." Evelyn hesitated. "He mentioned it? He worries you get anxious over legal language." The sentence irritated her more than she expected. "I'm simply reading before I sign." "That's probably unnecessary." Evelyn leaned back. "I don't think reading my own documents is unnecessary." Silence filled the line. Then Denise laughed softly. "I only meant Richard already has professionals handling everything." "So do I." The words surprised even Evelyn. She had not planned to say them. After ending the call, she searched online until she found the number for Alison Greer, a real estate attorney in downtown Asheville, whom one of her neighbors had recommended months earlier. The next morning, she carried copies of the documents into Alison's modest office. Unlike Richard's corporate attorneys, Alison asked very few questions at first. She simply read, page after page. Occasionally, she highlighted a paragraph or marked the margin with a yellow note. Nearly 40 minutes passed before she finally looked up. "Did your husband explain these?" He said they were routine. "They aren't exactly routine." Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. "What do? They shift risk." "Meaning, if several of these agreements are combined with earlier refinancing documents, your husband's business gains stronger legal ties to property that may once have been considered primarily marital." Evelyn stared across the desk. "I don't understand. I'm not saying you've lost anything." Alison chose her words carefully. "I'm saying the paper trail has become complicated." Complicated. It sounded dangerously close to Grandma Mabel's word. "Paperwork, should I sign?" "No." The answer came immediately. "Not until we obtain copies of every previous agreement connected to Birchwood Lane." Evelyn nodded slowly. She suddenly realized something deeply unsettling. She had never kept copies. Richard always filed everything. She drove home in silence. That evening, she waited until Richard fell asleep before quietly walking into his home office. The door wasn't locked. For years, she had never entered without asking. Tonight, she made a different choice. She opened one filing cabinet, Tax returns, insurance policies, business contracts, nothing unusual. The second drawer contained property files. She found the original purchase documents for Birchwood Lane. She found refinancing agreements. She found appraisal reports. But something was missing. There was no cashier's check from Grandma Mabel, no gift letter, no separate contribution record. She searched again, slower this time. Still nothing. Her heartbeat quickened. Grandma had specifically said she kept copies because paper disappeared. Had the originals disappeared already? Footsteps creaked overhead. Richard was awake. Evelyn quietly returned every folder exactly where she had found it and slipped back into the hallway. The next morning she opened the second drawer beside the stove. It was empty. Grandma Mabel's folded blue note was gone. Evelyn stood in front of the open kitchen drawer for a long time. She knew exactly where Grandma Mabel's folded note had been. She had tucked it beneath a stack of recipe cards years earlier, believing nobody would ever have a reason to touch it. Now only the recipes remained. She searched anyway. She removed every card, every measuring spoon, every old rubber band, even the faded address book tucked into the back corner. Nothing. The note was gone. Richard walked into the kitchen carrying his travel mug. "What are you looking for?" Evelyn turned before he could see the worry on her face. "Just an old note from Grandma. The one who always left little reminders?" She nodded. "I probably threw it away while cleaning one day." Richard smiled sympathetically. She'd understand. His answer came too easily. He kissed Evelyn on the forehead, grabbed his car keys, and left for work. Only after the garage door closed did she allow herself to think what she had been refusing to consider. Grandma Mabel had warned her that paper disappeared. Now the only paper that carried that warning had disappeared first. By noon, Evelyn was back in Alison Greer's office. This time she carried a legal pad instead of documents. "I think someone has been removing records from my house." Alison didn't dismiss the concern. Instead, she leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Evelyn described the missing note, the absent cashier's check, and the empty property file. She even mentioned Denise's habit of wandering through the house while nobody paid attention. Alison wrote quietly before asking one careful question. "Who controls the filing system in your home, Richard? And who usually decides which documents stay or go?" "He does." Alison nodded. "That's common in many marriages." She paused before continuing. "But common doesn't mean harmless." Evelyn folded her hands tightly together. "Am I imagining this?" "I don't think so." Alison opened a legal reference book on her desk. If important financial records disappeared over time while newer documents strengthened only one spouse's legal position, that could become significant later. Later? If there's ever a dispute. The word lingered. Dispute. Evelyn almost laughed. Richard and she had disagreements about vacations, landscaping, and what color to paint the guest room. They did not have disputes. At least that was what she still wanted to believe. Before leaving, Alison handed her a single sheet of paper. "Start your own file." "My own?" "Every receipt, every invoice, every email, every contribution." She looked directly at Evelyn. "Never assume someone else is preserving your history." That afternoon, Evelyn drove home without stopping anywhere. She found an empty storage box in the basement and labeled it in neat black letters, "House Records." For the first time in their marriage, she quietly began making copies of renovation receipts, copies of invoices she still had access to, copies of cancelled checks from her personal account that had paid for furniture, flooring, landscaping, and appliances. She rented a small safety deposit box at a community bank in Asheville the following week. Richard never learned it existed. Months turned into years. The file slowly grew. So did Richard's company. His face appeared in regional magazines beside restored Victorian homes and historic estates. Interviewers praised his artistic instincts. Business organizations invited him to speak about preservation and entrepreneurship. Evelyn attended many of those dinners. She applauded politely. She watched audiences admire a story that felt only half true. After one awards banquet, an elderly contractor named Glenn Satterfield approached their table. He shook Richard's hand first. Then he turned toward Evelyn. "I've always told people," Glenn said with a grin. "She's the one who actually knew those old houses." Richard laughed before Evelyn could answer. "We make a good team." Glenn's smile faded almost imperceptibly. "I remember Birchwood Lane, so do I," Richard replied. You kept asking me to change invoices. Silence settled over the table. Richard's expression never changed. What invoices? The renovation bills. Glenn scratched the back of his neck. You said it was cleaner if everything went under your business instead of listing separate purchases. Richard chuckled lightly. That was a long time ago. It sure was. Glenn looked toward Evelyn. I always wondered if you knew. Richard stepped between them with another easy smile. Excuse us for a second. He guided Glenn toward the bar. They spoke quietly for less than 2 minutes. When Glenn returned, he looked embarrassed. I must be remembering it wrong. He left without finishing his drink. The ride home felt strangely quiet. Evelyn stared through the passenger window. What was that about? Richard kept his eyes on the road. He's getting older. He seemed certain. He confused projects. She turned toward him. Did you ever ask contractors to bill your company instead of listing my purchases? Richard sighed. It simplified bookkeeping. My purchases, our purchases. You just said your company. Richard's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Evelyn. His voice remained calm. You know how accounting works. I actually don't. It's why accountants exist. The conversation ended there, not because Evelyn believed him, because she suddenly realized how often Richard answered questions without truly answering them. That realization refused to leave her. Weeks later, she quietly visited Glenn's workshop outside Black Mountain. The retired carpenter welcomed her warmly. I've been thinking about that dinner, she admitted. So have I. He invited her inside. Old cabinets, doors, and reclaimed beams filled the warehouse. Glenn walked toward a dusty metal filing cabinet. I keep more junk than my wife likes. He smiled while opening one drawer. But sometimes junk matters. He searched through yellow folders dated nearly 25 years earlier. Most were empty. Some held faded carbon copies. Finally, he stopped. Here he unfolded a brittle invoice. The paper had nearly browned with age. Across the top was the Birchwood Lane address. The labor description matched the front porch restoration Evelyn remembered paying for herself. But one handwritten note in the corner caught her attention. At Richard Hart's request, reissued under Hart Restoration Group for accounting purposes. Glenn frowned. I never wrote that. Who did? He looked closely. My office manager. Why? Richard told her to. Evelyn felt the room tilt ever so slightly. The invoice did not prove fraud, it did not explain everything. But it proved something much more dangerous. Someone had been quietly rewriting the paper trail years before she ever noticed. As Glenn reached back into the same folder, his hand stopped. There was another document in here. He frowned again. I know there was. What kind? A signed acknowledgement. He looked directly at Evelyn, confirming your personal payment for the materials. He searched the folder again, then the drawer, then another box. The acknowledgement had vanished. Glenn searched the cabinet a third time before finally stepping back. I don't understand it, he said quietly. I kept that acknowledgement clipped to the invoice for years. Evelyn looked at the empty folder without speaking. Missing papers were beginning to form a pattern instead of a coincidence. Glenn closed the drawer with a tired sigh. I can't prove it was ever there, you just told me you remembered it. I do. He rubbed his forehead. But remembering and proving are two different things. The sentence followed Evelyn all the way back to Asheville. That evening she called Allison. I found one invoice, she said, but another document that should have been attached is gone. Allison did not sound surprised. People usually don't remove every record, she replied. They remove the ones that connect the story. So what do I do now? You keep building the story from different directions. The next afternoon, Evelyn returned to the community bank where she kept her growing file. She added Glenn's invoice, her handwritten notes from their conversation, and a timeline listing every document that had disappeared over the years. As she closed the folder, something unexpected occurred to her. She had been looking only inside her own records. Grandma Mabel never trusted a single copy. She trusted duplicates. That evening, Evelyn drove to Burnsville, not to the cabin, to the small law office that had handled Grandma Mabel's estate years earlier. The brass plaque outside still carried the same family name, Hendricks & Cole. Only one attorney remained. Walter Hendricks had retired, but his longtime partner, Margaret Cole, still practiced part-time. She recognized Evelyn immediately. I haven't seen you since your grandmother's service. Evelyn smiled sadly. I wish this were only a visit. Margaret invited her inside. After listening carefully, she folded her hands across the desk. "I need to be honest," she said. "Most client files that old are destroyed under our retention policy, I understand." But Margaret paused. "Your grandmother wasn't an ordinary client. She disappeared into a records room. Nearly 15 minutes passed. When she returned, she carried a thin archival box. I almost forgot this existed. She placed it carefully on the desk. Your grandmother specifically instructed us not to destroy one supplemental file." Evelyn leaned forward. "Why?" She said someone might need it decades later. Margaret opened the box. Inside were only 3 items: a copy of Grandma Mabel's will, a receipt confirming legal storage of personal documents, and a handwritten memorandum prepared by Walter Hendricks after one private meeting with Mabel. Evelyn read the first paragraph slowly. "Client requests confirmation that personal financial gifts intended exclusively for granddaughter remain documented separately from marital property." Her breathing slowed. "Is this enough?" Margaret shook her head gently. "No, but it confirms your grandmother anticipated future confusion." "Did she leave the actual records here?" "No. Do you know where?" Margaret looked thoughtful. "She mentioned only one place she trusted more than a law office, the cabin." Margaret nodded. "I never knew where it was." Neither woman spoke for several seconds. The answer had always been waiting. The cabin had never been a retreat. It had been an archive. On the drive home, Evelyn almost turned toward Burnsville's mountain roads. Instead, she forced herself back to Asheville. Not yet. Grandma had told her to go only when memory wasn't enough. Despite everything, Evelyn still hoped she would never need to. That hope lasted less than 6 months. The divorce petition arrived on a gray Monday morning. A process server waited politely at the front porch while Evelyn trimmed dead branches from the hydrangeas she had planted nearly 3 decades earlier. He handed her a large envelope. "I'm sorry, ma'am." She thanked him automatically. Richard wasn't home. He had left before sunrise for what he called a commercial development meeting in Charlotte. Evelyn carried the envelope inside. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she stood in the kitchen looking around the room she had rebuilt with her own hands. The cabinets, the wide farmhouse sink, the polished pine floor, the afternoon light crossing the table, nothing had changed. Everything had changed. She opened the envelope. The first pages dissolved into legal language. Irreconcilable differences, equitable distribution, property allocation, business valuation. By the final pages, one sentence made her sit down. Richard sought exclusive ownership of Birchwood Lane. She read the line again, then again. When Richard returned late that evening, she was waiting at the kitchen table. The divorce papers rested neatly beside 2 untouched coffee mugs. He stopped walking. For one brief moment, his practiced confidence disappeared. "I wanted to explain." "No," her voice remained calm. "You wanted your attorney to explain." Richard slowly removed his jacket. "It doesn't have to become ugly." She looked directly at him. "When did you decide?" He answered honestly. "Months ago." "And all the paperwork? It was business, was it?" He hesitated. "The business needed protecting." "What about the marriage?" Richard lowered his eyes. "I don't think we've had one for a long time." The words hurt. Not because they ended something, because they described something that had already disappeared years earlier. Within days, Evelyn met Allison again. This meeting felt different from every previous consultation. Now there was an actual case. Allison spread the divorce filings across her conference table. Richard's financial disclosures, property schedules, corporate ownership records, mortgage history. She read silently for nearly an hour. Finally, she removed her glasses. "Evelyn, what is it? I need you to prepare yourself." "For what?" "The paper trail overwhelmingly favors Richard." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "But I paid for so much, I believe you. I worked in that house almost every day, I know, but belief isn't evidence." Allison slid one document across the table. The ownership history listed refinancing after refinancing, business restructuring, title adjustments. Every signature was genuine. Every signature belonged to Evelyn. She stared at her own name. Each page carried a piece of herself. Each page also carried away another piece of Birchwood Lane. Then Allison turned to the calendar on her desk. "There is something else." Evelyn looked up. "If we're going to challenge any part of this property settlement after judgment, we will have an extremely limited window." "How limited?" Allison met her eyes. 10 days. The room suddenly felt much smaller. and unless we find evidence strong enough to reopen the property record before that deadline, she left the sentence unfinished. Evelyn already understood. Grandma Mabel's cabin was no longer a memory. It had become her last chance. The 10-day deadline settled over Evelyn's life like a clock she could hear even in silence. She packed only what she needed: 2 suitcases, the cedar chest Grandma Mabel had left her, her growing file of copied records. Allison had told her not to waste time arguing with Richard, and for once Evelyn obeyed without hesitation. She spent the next 3 days moving into a small furnished room owned by Nadine Crowell, a widow from her church in Weaverville. "It isn't much," Nadine said as she handed Evelyn a key. "It doesn't have to be." The room held a narrow bed, a worn oak dresser, and a single window overlooking maple trees beginning to lose their leaves. It wasn't home, but it was peaceful. No polished speeches, no locked office, no carefully managed explanations. That first night Evelyn barely slept. Every unfamiliar sound reminded her she no longer belonged at Birchwood Lane. Just before dawn she opened the cedar chest Grandma Mabel had given her years ago. Folded quilts rested neatly on top. Beneath them were old table linens, holiday cards, and a Bible with worn leather corners. She carefully lifted each item. At the very bottom sat the blue envelope tied with faded string. She had obeyed Grandma's instructions for years. Now the deadline had changed everything. Her hands trembled as she untied the string. Inside lay the iron key she already recognized. Behind it rested a folded hand-drawn map: past Burnsville, cross Cane River, turn after the White Church, 3rd Gravel Road. She unfolded one final sheet. Grandma's handwriting remained steady despite the years. When memory no longer protects your life, let the truth do it instead. Nothing more, no explanation, no list, just one sentence. Evelyn closed her eyes. Grandma had known this day would come. By sunrise she was already driving toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. The farther she traveled, the weaker her phone signal became. Civilization slowly disappeared behind forests and narrow mountain roads. Gas stations became scattered. Traffic vanished almost entirely. She stopped once beside the old white church shown on the map. The cemeteries behind it overlooked rolling hills covered in morning fog. Everything matched. Grandma had drawn this herself. The gravel road appeared exactly where the map promised. Branches brushed against Evelyn's car as she climbed higher into the mountains. Finally, the trees opened. The cabin stood alone inside a small clearing, weathered cedar walls, a rusted tin roof, one crooked porch railing. Nothing about it looked valuable. Everything about it looked protected. Evelyn stepped onto the porch carrying only her backpack and the iron key. The lock resisted before slowly turning. The front door groaned open. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. The cabin had remained untouched for years. A stone fireplace filled one wall. Simple shelves held old mason jars and folded blankets. Near the window stood a sturdy wooden kitchen table scarred by decades of use. Evelyn smiled through unexpected tears. She had seen this table before. Not here, in Grandma's stories. She walked slowly through the room. Nothing appeared unusual. For several minutes she wondered if she had misunderstood everything. Perhaps Grandma had only wanted her to have a safe place. Then she noticed the floor. One board beneath the table sat slightly higher than the others. Her heartbeat quickened. 3rd board from the left, exactly as Grandma had described. She knelt carefully. The board lifted almost effortlessly. Someone had loosened it years earlier. Beneath it rested a shallow compartment lined with oilcloth. Inside sat a small metal box. Not elegant, not expensive, just practical. The iron key fit perfectly into its lock. The lid opened with a quiet click. Inside rested a single blue folder tied with white ribbon. Nothing else, no jewelry, no cash, no deed, only papers. Across the front, written in Grandma Mabel's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words: "For the home they will try to erase." Evelyn stared without touching it. Outside, wind moved softly through the pine trees. Inside, the cabin remained perfectly still. She untied the ribbon. The first page was a handwritten letter. "My dear Evelyn, if you are reading this, someone has finally convinced a court that paper matters more than the life you lived." Her vision blurred instantly. She continued reading. "I prayed you would never need this box, but I have watched too many women disappear from the record while their work remained standing for everyone else to admire." Evelyn wiped her eyes. Grandma had never been preparing for disaster. She had been preparing for history. Beneath the letter lay another document, a certified copy of the cashier's check Grandma had given her decades earlier. The memo line remained perfectly clear. Gift to Evelyn Parker for personal contribution toward Birchwood Lane. Separate property contribution. A bank certification stamp covered the bottom corner. Evelyn stopped breathing for several seconds. She carefully lifted the next document, a notarized affidavit. Grandma had signed it nearly 30 years earlier before 2 witnesses. It described exactly why the money had been given, exactly who owned it, exactly how it was never intended to become Richard's separate asset. Every page answered a question the missing records had left behind. Behind those came purchase receipts, building supply invoices, landscape drainage payments, tile orders, lumber purchases. Every receipt listed Evelyn as purchaser. Many carried handwritten notes initialed by Grandma confirming payment had come directly from Evelyn's own account. Then came photographs, not posed photographs, working photographs. Evelyn carrying porch railings, Evelyn sanding hardwood floors, Evelyn measuring kitchen cabinets while contractors stood nearby. On the back of each photo, Grandma had written dates, locations, and the names of everyone present, witnesses. She had been documenting everything, not for memories, for evidence. Near the bottom of the folder rested one final sealed envelope. Unlike the others, this one carried fresh tape across the flap. On the front, Grandma had written only 5 words. Open only with your lawyer. Evelyn reached toward it, then stopped. Allison's words echoed inside her mind. Don't disturb original evidence unless necessary. She slowly lowered her hand. Instead, she searched through the remaining contents. One folded page slipped free and landed face down on the table. She turned it over. It wasn't another receipt. It was a handwritten list. 23 names, contractors, neighbors, closing staff, accountants. Beside each name, Grandma had written one short sentence describing exactly what that person had witnessed. At the very bottom of the page, one final note had been added in darker ink years later. One of them helped Richard change the records. They will know who they are. Evelyn froze. Someone inside the original circle hadn't merely stayed silent. Someone had actively helped rewrite the truth. Evelyn read the final note 3 more times before folding it carefully back into the blue folder. Someone had helped Richard. Grandma Mabel had not guessed. She had known. The realization settled deeper than any legal document. Richard had not built his version of the truth alone. Someone close enough to witness the beginning had quietly helped erase it. She looked at the list again. Most names belonged to contractors she remembered well. Others were neighbors, the closing assistant from the title company, and local suppliers who had watched Birchwood Lane come back to life one room at a time. One name carried a small star beside it. Willa Crane, former closing assistant, knows where every copy went. Evelyn checked her. 1 bar, not enough. She gathered the folder, locked the tin box again, and placed every original document exactly as Grandma had arranged them. Before leaving, she photographed each page with her phone, careful to capture every signature, date, and handwritten note. Only then did she close the floorboard. The cabin had protected the truth for nearly 30 years. Now it was Evelyn's responsibility to protect it. She reached the old white church shortly after noon. 2 bars appeared on her screen. She called Allison immediately. Evelyn, I found it. What did you find? My grandmother's records. There was a pause. What kind of records? The cashier's check, a notarized statement, original receipts, photographs, a witness list. Allison stopped interrupting. Instead, she listened while Evelyn described each document. When she finished, the attorney spoke more slowly than before. Do not leave those papers anywhere. I won't. Don't mail them. I won't. And don't tell Richard what you found. Evelyn looked toward the empty highway. I haven't spoken to him. Good. Another pause followed. Evelyn, yes? If these documents are authentic, and they sound authentic, they could change the entire property argument. Hope rose inside Evelyn before Allison continued, but we still have to verify everything. The reminder mattered. Evidence had to survive scrutiny, not just emotion. How much time do we have now? Allison glanced at something on her desk. The hearing is over, but we're still inside the 10-day window. 9 days now. 9. The number suddenly felt very small. I'll meet you tomorrow morning. No, Allison surprised her. Not tomorrow. Why? Today. By late afternoon, Evelyn was back in Asheville. Allison had already arranged for a certified document examiner to inspect the notarized statement and compare seals with archived county records. Nothing would happen overnight. But the process had begun. While the examiner worked, Allison spread the photographs across her conference table. She studied each one carefully. They're excellent. They're just pictures. They're dated. She pointed toward the handwritten notes. They identify witnesses. Then she picked up one image showing Evelyn kneeling beside stacks of lumber. Who's standing behind you? Evelyn leaned closer. That's Glenn. And the man beside him? She frowned. I honestly don't remember. The man's face was partially hidden beneath a baseball cap. Allison turned the photograph over. Grandma had written 2 names. Glenn Satterfield. Dennis Rowe. Evelyn searched her memory. Dennis, the name felt familiar. Then it came back. He worked for the title company. Allison looked up immediately. The same title company that handled your closing. I think so. And the same office where Willa Crane worked. The room grew noticeably quieter. Another connection, another thread. Not proof, but a direction. Allison opened her notebook. I want you to contact Glenn again. I can do that. I'll reach out to Willa through formal channels. What about Dennis? If he's still alive, we'll find him. As Evelyn gathered the photographs, one slipped onto the floor. She bent to pick it up. This time she noticed something she had missed before. Richard stood in the background. He wasn't looking at the house. He was watching Dennis. The 2 men appeared to be speaking privately while Glenn and Evelyn measured lumber several yards away. It looked ordinary, almost forgettable. Yet Grandma had chosen that exact photograph to preserve. Allison. The attorney looked over. I think Grandma wanted us to notice something. Allison studied the image again. Maybe. She didn't speculate further. Neither woman needed assumptions, they needed facts. That evening Evelyn returned to Nadine's house carrying only photocopies. The originals rested inside Allison's office safe. For the first time since leaving Birchwood Lane, Evelyn slept for almost 4 uninterrupted hours. The peace didn't last. At 7 the next morning her phone rang. Glenn. His voice sounded strained. Evelyn, I remembered something after you left. What is it? That acknowledgement wasn't the only paper Richard wanted changed. Evelyn sat upright. What do you mean? There was a phone call. When? Right after the closing. Glenn hesitated. I wasn't supposed to hear it. What did you hear? I walked into the office while Dennis was on the line. Dennis Rowe? Yes. What did he say? Glenn took a slow breath. He told Richard, his voice lowered, I'll move the family contribution into the general closing file. Nobody will question it after enough years. Evelyn gripped the phone tighter. Are you certain? I've lived with that sentence for almost 30 years. Why didn't you tell anyone? I thought it was bookkeeping. His voice broke with regret. I didn't understand what they were burying until you showed me that invoice. Evelyn closed her eyes. One question had finally been answered. The records hadn't simply disappeared. Someone inside the closing process had helped hide them. But Glenn wasn't finished. There's something else. What? I found an old address book this morning. So? Dennis retired years ago. A long silence followed, but I still have his personal number. Evelyn wrote Dennis Rowe's phone number twice before slipping the paper into her notebook. One copy stayed with her. The other went straight to Allison. She had learned enough over the past week to understand that evidence meant very little if only one person possessed it. Allison called within 20 minutes. Don't contact him alone. I wasn't planning to. I'd like him interviewed with a witness present. You think he'll talk? I think people who have carried a secret for 30 years sometimes want someone to ask the right question. By late afternoon they drove together to a modest retirement community outside Hendersonville. Dennis lived alone in a brick duplex overlooking a small pond. His mailbox leaned slightly to one side, and several unopened gardening catalogs sat on the front step. He answered the door after the second knock. His hair had turned completely white, but Evelyn recognized him immediately from Grandma's photograph. He recognized her too. His expression changed before she even spoke. Evelyn, he whispered her name as though he had been expecting it for years. I'm not here to accuse you, she said quietly. I only want the truth. Dennis looked past her toward Allison. You're an attorney, I am, and this conversation? It stays exactly as the law requires, Allison replied. No tricks, no pressure. Dennis stood silently for several seconds. Finally, he stepped aside. You'd better come in. His living room was modest and carefully kept. Old woodworking tools lined one wall, framed landscape photographs covered another. Nothing suggested wealth or influence. It looked like the home of a man who had lived quietly after retirement. He offered coffee. Neither woman accepted. Dennis lowered himself slowly into an armchair. I suppose Glenn finally remembered. He remembered enough, Evelyn answered. Dennis closed his eyes. He always had a better memory than I did. Allison placed a legal pad on her lap, Mr. Rowe, did you alter the closing records for Birchwood Lane? The question remained in the room long after it was spoken. Dennis rubbed both hands together. No, Evelyn felt her shoulders tighten. Then he continued, I didn't alter them. I moved them. Silence, the family contribution letter, the separate gift documentation, the original cashier's check copy. I transferred them from the primary closing file. Why? Allison asked. Dennis looked directly at Evelyn. Because Richard convinced me they would be incorporated into a consolidated record later. No. His answer came immediately. He said it would simplify future financing. Evelyn barely breathed, so you helped him. Dennis nodded once. I did, but I never destroyed anything. Where did the records go? I honestly believed they stayed with his attorney. Allison leaned forward. Did you ever verify that? Dennis shook his head. I should have. His voice cracked. I've regretted that conversation for years. Evelyn searched his face. She expected defensiveness. Instead, she found shame. I trusted him, Dennis continued quietly. He talked about business expansion. He said duplicate files created confusion. He made it sound routine. Allison asked the next question carefully. Did Richard ever offer you money? No. Any favors? No. Anything at all? Dennis hesitated. Then he nodded slightly. He recommended me for a county records position 6 months later. The room fell quiet. Not a bribe, not direct proof, but another piece of the pattern. Evelyn opened Grandma's witness list. She wrote that someone helped Richard rewrite the story. Dennis lowered his head. I suppose that was me. No, Evelyn said softly. You helped him hide part of it. She looked directly at him. He rewrote the story. For the first time since they entered the house, Dennis looked relieved. Not forgiven, simply understood. There is something else, he said after a long silence. I never told anyone because I couldn't prove it. Allison waited. The week after closing, Dennis pointed toward an old filing cabinet near the hallway. Richard came back. Back where? To the title office. He requested access to the archived duplicate packet. Was that allowed? No. So how did he get it? Dennis looked embarrassed. The office manager unlocked the storage room. Willa Crane? Evelyn asked. No. Willa wasn't there that afternoon. Who was? Janice Holloway. Neither Evelyn nor Allison recognized the name. She supervised archived files. Dennis slowly stood and walked toward the filing cabinet. I kept something. He unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside lay several neatly labeled folders. He removed one marked personal. From it he withdrew an old spiral notebook. I wrote down unusual requests. He turned carefully through yellowed pages until stopping on an entry dated 29 years earlier. Richard Hart requested review of duplicate closing packet. Present with Janice Holloway. Family contribution documents removed for attorney review. No return confirmed. Dennis handed the notebook to Allison. I signed every daily log. So did Janice. Allison photographed the page before carefully placing it inside an evidence envelope. This helps. It isn't enough, Dennis replied. No, Allison admitted, but it confirms another step in the chain. Evelyn looked around the quiet room. For years she had imagined a mastermind controlling everything without leaving footprints. Instead, she found ordinary people making ordinary decisions, trusting explanations, avoiding questions, looking away at exactly the wrong moment. That realization hurt almost as much as Richard's betrayal. People had not helped erase her because they hated her. They simply found it easier to believe the confident man. As they prepared to leave, Dennis stopped them at the front door. I owe you one more truth. Evelyn turned. The day Richard collected those records, Dennis swallowed hard. He wasn't alone. Allison looked up immediately. Who was with him? Dennis frowned, searching his memory. A woman. His sister? No. The attorney's assistant? No. He closed his eyes. I remember because she signed the visitor register. He pointed toward the notebook, still resting in Allison's evidence folder. I copied the name somewhere. He flipped several more pages, then his finger stopped. There. Evelyn leaned closer. The signature belonged to someone she knew, not Janice Holloway, not Willa Crane, not anyone from the title company. It was Denise Hart. Richard's sister had been inside the archive on the same day the original family contribution records disappeared. Denise Hart's name changed everything. Allison filed the emergency motion before the 10-day deadline closed. She attached copies of Grandma Mabel's notarized affidavit, the certified cashier's check, the dated photographs, Glenn's invoice, Dennis Rowe's notebook entry, and a sworn preliminary statement from Dennis confirming that Richard had requested the removal of the family contribution records from the primary closing file. The judge did not return Birchwood Lane to Evelyn that day. No one expected that. But the court did something Richard had spent years trying to avoid. It reopened the property record. The settlement conference took place 1 week later in a quiet room at the Buncombe County Courthouse. Richard arrived in a dark suit with Denise beside him. She looked composed until she saw Dennis Rowe sitting across the room. Then her face tightened. Richard's attorney tried to frame the matter as confusion from decades-old paperwork. Allison did not argue emotion. She placed the documents on the table one by one, the bank certification, the notarized statement, the receipts, the photographs with Grandma Mabel's handwriting, the title office log. Then she placed Dennis's signed statement beside Denise's visitor entry. Richard's attorney stopped taking notes. Allison turned to Denise first. "Did you accompany Richard to the title office archive after the closing?" Denise looked at Richard. He did not look back. "I don't remember," she said. Dennis spoke quietly from the end of the table. "You signed the register." Allison slid the copy forward. Denise stared at her own name as if it belonged to someone else. "I was helping my brother organize files." "What files?" "Business files. For a house he had not bought alone." Denise's mouth opened. No answer came. Richard finally leaned forward. "This is being exaggerated." Evelyn looked at him then. For years his voice had ended conversations. In that room it did not. "No," she said. "It is being recorded." The sentence settled harder than anger. Allison asked about the invoices Richard had reissued under his company. He called it bookkeeping. She asked about the family contribution documents. He called it organization. She asked why Evelyn's personal receipts had disappeared from the property file. He said old records often got lost. Then Allison opened the sealed envelope Grandma had marked for an attorney. Inside was a copy of a letter Grandma Mabel had mailed to Richard 30 years earlier. It was short, formal, and devastating. It stated that her cashier's check was a personal gift to Evelyn, not to Richard, not to his business, and not to any future refinancing structure. At the bottom was a certified mail receipt. Richard had signed for it. His face changed for the first time. Not much, but enough. Denise looked at him as if she had just realized she had protected a lie larger than the one she had been told. The court did not treat the letter as magic. It did not erase years of signatures or undo the divorce by itself. But combined with the bank records, witness statements, and document trail, it forced the matter into supervised resolution. Richard's attorney requested a private break. Evelyn refused to leave the room until Allison nodded that it was proper. 2 hours later, the terms changed. Richard would keep Birchwood Lane, but he would reimburse Evelyn for Grandma Mabel's separate family contribution with adjusted value. He would compensate her for documented restoration costs and a portion of the increased property value tied to her labor, materials, and design work. He would amend business records that had listed her contributions as company expenses. He would sign a corrective statement acknowledging that Evelyn Carter had made substantial documented contributions to the acquisition, restoration, and increased value of Birchwood Lane. Denise was removed from all remaining property administration connected to Richard's holdings during the review. Dennis submitted a full statement to the title company and state licensing board. Glenn provided copies of every surviving invoice. Willa Crane, found through old professional records, confirmed that Grandma Mabel had requested copies of closing documents long before the marriage collapsed. Richard did not go to prison. He did not lose everything overnight. Real life rarely worked that way, but he lost control of the story. Clients withdrew quietly. 2 preservation board invitations vanished. His reputation, once built on integrity and taste, became attached to a question he could not answer cleanly. Denise called Evelyn once. "I'm sorry," she said. Evelyn listened. She did not comfort her. You helped him because it was easier to believe I didn't matter, Evelyn said. Denise cried softly on the other end. Evelyn ended the call without cruelty, and without forgiveness she did not feel. A month later, the money arrived. Evelyn sat in Allison's office and read the corrective statement 3 times. Her name was there, her work was there, not as memory, not as someone else's kindness. As record. She did not go back to Birchwood Lane. She drove past once in late spring. The porch looked freshly painted. The dogwood was blooming. For a moment, grief rose so sharply she had to pull over. Then she kept driving. Back in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Grandma Mabel's cabin waited. Evelyn repaired the roof first, then the porch railing, then the stuck kitchen window. She sanded the old table but left its scars visible. She placed the blue folder in a fireproof box, not hidden beneath the floor anymore, but protected where truth belonged. By summer, the cabin had become more than shelter. It became her studio. Neighbors asked for help restoring old homes. A retired couple hired her to redesign a farmhouse kitchen. A widowed shop owner asked her to save the original woodwork in a store Richard's company had once dismissed as worthless. They called Evelyn, not Richard. One quiet morning, she stood beneath the south-facing window with coffee in her hand. Sunlight crossed the floor where she had once knelt and found the tin box. Grandma Mabel's letter rested framed on the wall. Evelyn had lost the house that forgot her, but she had found the place that remembered her first. If Evelyn's choice stayed with you, share what you think mattered most. The proof, the justice, or the peace she chose afterward. And stay close for more stories about the truths people try to bury and the courage it takes to bring them back.